On a mountainside overlooking the sea in New Zealand, a vast forest is growing in a highly unusual way. It was not planted by humans, nor is it a surviving remnant of an ancient forest. After 39 years, hillsides that were once dry and barren are now covered by a canopy of native trees. Forest birds that had been absent for 2 centuries have returned, streams no longer run dry, and more than 50 waterfalls have begun flowing through the valleys. The strangest part is that this forest grew directly beneath one of New Zealand's most hated plants, gorse. For generations, from grandfathers to fathers to sons, farming families burned it, cut it down, sprayed it with chemicals, and crushed it with bulldozers in an effort to eliminate it. But it always returned, growing back even more densely than before. In 1987, Hugh Wilson was put in charge of a 109-hectare property that had been completely covered by gorse. He was the only person who knew how to find a way to eradicate the plant, but he chose not to do it. Instead, he announced that he would allow the gorse to keep growing. The farmers living nearby believed he had lost his mind. 2 weeks later, Wilson received a letter from a neighboring farmer. The man called him a fool and a dreamer, claiming that Wilson would destroy the land and ruin every farm in the surrounding area. And for the next 10 years, that decision looked like a failure. The gorse continued growing taller. Yellow flowers blanketed the slopes, and the forest Wilson believed in still had not appeared. This is the story of a remarkable ecological recovery made possible by an invasive plant in New Zealand, supported by records from Hinewai, scientific studies, and historical documents, including the writings of Charles Darwin. Looking further back before the land was cleared, nearly the entire Banks Peninsula was continuously covered by native forest, stretching from the mountain peaks all the way down to the coast. But in less than 50 years, people cut down and burned most of the forest, turning it into grazing land. Worse still, humans were the ones who brought gorse here and planted it as a cheap living fence. Its dense, thorny bushes kept livestock from wandering and cost less than any man-made fence. In 1835, a young Charles Darwin saw these hedgerows here. People had deliberately planted the very species they would spend the next 90 years fighting. Dense thickets of thorny gorse took over the pastures, blocked livestock and machinery, increased management costs, and reduced farmers' income. By 1900, the plant had been officially classified as a noxious weed. On the property that would later become Hinewai, the previous owner had sprayed chemicals, burned the vegetation, and used bulldozers to clear the gorse, but it still grew back. Of course, people did not stop there. Instead, they turned to more extreme methods. They introduced 7 non-native insect species into New Zealand, including beetles, mites, and moths, hoping they would damage gorse seeds, shoots, and stems. Although these insects caused significant harm, none of them was able to completely eliminate the plant. In fact, Hugh Wilson was not the person who bought the property. It was purchased by Maurice White, a local accountant and businessman. After saving money, White and Colin Averill established a charitable trust in 1977 with the goal of buying land on the Banks Peninsula to protect native forest. The turning point came in 1986 when White met Hugh Wilson at a forest and bird meeting in Christchurch. White asked whether he knew of any land worth buying and protecting. Wilson immediately thought of the hills east of Akaroa, a steep, difficult-to-farm area so heavily covered in gorse that many people considered it almost worthless. In September 1987, the trust purchased its first 109 hectares, named the property Hinewai Reserve, and placed Wilson in charge of managing it. But Wilson was not a dreamer acting purely on instinct. Before that, he had spent 5 years surveying plant life across the entire Banks Peninsula. He established a network of survey points and documented 1,331 sample plots, each measuring about 6 by 6 meters. To reach some locations, he had to travel by boat to the base of cliffs or be lowered down by rope. This work allowed Wilson to know exactly which species still survived, where forests had once grown, and from which direction native seed sources might return. During those surveys, he noticed something that most farmers had no reason to look for. Beneath old gorse thickets, shade-tolerant native plants such as maho and poroporo were quietly germinating. They grew better beneath the thorny shrub canopy than they did in open pasture, where sunlight, wind, and browsing animals made it difficult for young plants to survive. Although gorse was a dangerous invasive species for agriculture, it was also acting as a nurse canopy. Why did gorse keep returning every time people burned the land, plowed it, or cleared it with bulldozers? That question helped Wilson become the one person who understood how the species could truly be defeated. The secret lay in the seed bank beneath the soil. Gorse produces enormous numbers of seeds with extremely hard outer coats, and research in New Zealand has shown that some of these seeds can remain alive for decades. At 2 study sites, about 1% of the seeds buried 5 centimeters deep were still viable after 20 years. New Zealand plant management sources have also recorded that gorse seeds can survive much longer under suitable conditions. As a result, when bulldozers disturbed the soil, plows brought buried seeds closer to the surface, or fire removed the vegetation above them, people unintentionally created exactly what gorse needed most: bare ground and strong sunlight. Hugh Wilson explained that burning, spraying, cutting, or bulldozing away the canopy could trigger large numbers of dormant seeds to germinate at the same time. In other words, every time farmers believed they had ended the battle, they were actually waking up a new generation of gorse. Wilson understood that the fight could not be won by repeating the old methods. Instead of continuing to awaken the buried seed bank, he decided to leave the gorse canopy in place, remove the real causes of the problem, and allow native trees to grow beneath it. In fact, although Hugh Wilson had presented his observations in botanical publications, the people living around Hinewai were not easily convinced. The opposition went far beyond the letter describing the project as the work of fools and dreamers. Although the reserve was privately owned, admission was completely free. During an open day for neighboring residents, one person recalled that the thickets were so dense that almost everything in sight was yellow. Had you been standing outside the fence at the time, you probably would have thought Wilson was failing too. Wilson did not allow the criticism to change his plan. He complied with regulations by maintaining a strip about 10 meters wide, free of gorse and broom, along nearly 17 kilometers of the reserve's boundary. However, he continued protecting the gorse inside the reserve as a nurse canopy. At the same time, he removed the sheep and cattle, repaired the fences, controlled possums, and eliminated more than 70 feral goats that had been eating young plants. It was not until 1999 that the reserve's large goat population was completely brought under control. Now take a closer look at what this plan actually did. Gorse did not save the forest in the way you might think. Instead, it unintentionally created a process that ecologists call facilitation. Like a caregiver raising a child who is not their own, gorse nurtured a forest that did not belong to it. Hinewai's official website confirms that gorse, broom, ferns, and native shrubs became nurse canopies, beneath which native forests began to regenerate. The first effect occurred underground. Gorse is related to clover and peas. Like them, it makes the soil more fertile. Bacteria living on its roots take nitrogen directly from the air and transfer it into the soil. Gorse can fix up to about 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare each year. Fallen leaves and branches then decompose, creating a nitrogen-rich layer of organic matter that gradually makes nutrient-poor land more suitable for plants. As a result, land that had been depleted by livestock once again became suitable for trees to grow. However, this does not mean gorse is always beneficial. The species once covered approximately 900,000 hectares in New Zealand, and excess nitrogen can also affect water sources. Meanwhile, the thorny bushes grew into a solid wall that no sheep or cattle could pass through. They also created deep shade. In this way, gorse enriched the soil, protected it from livestock, and shielded it from direct sunlight. Without realizing it, this weed was preparing the perfect environment for a future forest. Then the birds began to arrive. Inside the thorny bushes, they were safe because larger predators could not reach them. Birds flew to these branches from the remaining patches of ancient forest, carrying seeds from forest trees in their droppings. Those seeds fell through the thorny branches and landed on the fertile soil below. In this way, gorse nurtured the very thing that would eventually kill it. Te Ara documented a 15-year-old gorse stand at Hinewai. Immediately after browsing, animals were removed. Almost no young trees could be seen. But just 3 years later, many maho and poroporo trees had appeared. This process did not happen in only a few years. A review by New Zealand's Department of Conservation found that gorse was still growing vigorously at 10 years old when its branches began breaking under their own weight. The thickets became less dense, sunlight started reaching the ground, and beneath them, the young trees were ready. They had grown beneath the shade of the gorse, protected by it. Now they reached toward the light, grew taller than the thorny bushes, and blocked the sunlight gorse needed. The weed that people had spent 90 years trying to destroy with fire and chemicals turned out to be the shortest path for the forest to return. The first real test of the gorse came sooner than Wilson expected. In 1988, just 1 year after Hinewai was established, the Banks Peninsula experienced a severe summer drought. According to a later account by Marie Haley, the daughter of a farmer who lived next to the reserve, pastures on many farms dried out, livestock feed became scarce, and her family's cattle began to struggle. But on Hugh Wilson's land, some of the grass was still alive. This became the first test of his minimal intervention approach. Without livestock constantly trampling the ground, the soil was less compacted, allowing it to remain more porous and absorb water more effectively. The dense gorse thickets also created a cooler microclimate close to the ground, reducing direct sunlight and slowing evaporation. Picture the contrast. Outside, the fence was open pasture exposed to the sun. Inside, the ground remained sheltered, with enough plant material still available to save the hungry animals. Wilson opened the gate and allowed his neighbor's cattle to enter and graze on the remaining grass. The man who had once believed Wilson would destroy the entire area later became one of his lifelong supporters. After that incident, nothing appeared to change. The gorse thickets were still standing, and they were still as yellow as ever. The neighbors continued to mock him. In 1991, 3 years after the drought, the Morris White Native Forest Trust had saved enough money to purchase another roughly 870 hectares of Otanerito Station, expanding Hinewai to nearly 1,000 hectares. Later land purchases continued to enlarge the reserve to about 1,250 hectares, almost 10 times its original size. Most of the newly acquired land was not flat or easy to manage. It consisted of steep mountain slopes, deep valleys, and gullies with almost no road access. At the time, Hugh Wilson still did not own a car. About once every 10 days, he rode his bicycle a total of 90 kilometers to reach the property and return home. Later, he moved there permanently, living in a small, solar-powered house in the middle of the land that the entire community believed was being neglected. 1 year passed, then 3 years, 5 years, and nearly 10 years. All people could still see were hillsides covered in yellow gorse flowers. There was no tall forest and no clear evidence that Wilson's method was working. On the contrary, everything seemed to suggest that the neighbor's letter had been right, but then the land began to change. In 1994, Wilson published data showing that native forest was regenerating rapidly through areas covered by gorse and broom. The true turning point came in 1997, when the gorse thickets in the oldest section of the property began to collapse. This did not happen everywhere at once. It appeared in patches, specifically in places where young native trees had begun growing earliest. The native trees had become tall enough to form a canopy and begin competing for sunlight. As the forest canopy closed, the gorse lost the energy it needed, while the native trees pushed upward through the wall of thorns. The neighbor whom Wilson had helped during the drought later admitted that he had been certain the process would take 50 years and that it might never happen at all. But the forest developed in just 10 years. The answer had been right in front of them the entire time. The farmers were not wrong about the plant. They were wrong about everything else. The real problem was not the gorse, but the grazing pressure from sheep, cattle, and goats. Livestock rarely ate gorse because of its tough, thorny branches. Instead, they continuously grazed on the softer native plants growing beneath it. Native trees still germinated every year, but as soon as they emerged from the ground, they were bitten back to the base. They could only grow again and be eaten again, never becoming tall enough to rise above the gorse and form a forest canopy. Gorse was therefore not immortal. It survived for so long only because the trees capable of shading it out and replacing it had never been allowed to mature. Once the livestock were removed, that balance began to change. Just as the neighbors were beginning to pay attention to the project and place their trust in it, nature once again pushed Wilson's method to its limits. On the 13th of July 2011, a major fire believed to have been caused by lightning burned through about 1/3 of Hinewai. In a short time, areas that had been recovering for years were reduced to blackened hillsides. But what was remarkable was that the ecosystem did not have to start again from zero. Gorse regenerated in the newly opened, sunlit spaces, while native shrubs and forest trees also returned from seeds, roots, and surviving patches of vegetation. 6 years later, Hinewai's newsletter reported that the signs of the fire had become very difficult to recognize. 10 years later, an even more intense test arrived. Over 4 days in mid-December 2021, The monitoring station at Hinewai recorded 304.2 millimeters of rain, with at least 200 millimeters falling on December 15 alone. Nearly 100 landslides merged into long strips of exposed earth, stretching for kilometers, some more than 50 meters wide. Satellite image analysis estimated that at least 63 hectares, and possibly close to 70 hectares, had been completely stripped of vegetation. Soil and rock swept away mature trees, bridges, fences, and long sections of walking trails. Looking at these wounds across the landscape, you might think Hinewai would need decades to become green again. But just 21 days after the storm, young gorse plants had already appeared on some of the landslide surfaces. By day 65, thousands of small wineberry plants, along with poroporo, gorse, broom, and many other species, had begun to grow. After 6 months, areas where the topsoil remained were almost completely covered by vegetation. Some poroporo plants had reached 1 meter in height, while maho, fuchsia, and seven-finger regenerated from seeds, roots, and broken pieces of stems that had been carried downhill. As of 2026, the project has been underway for 39 years. Hinewai's greatest achievement is not that it turned an invasive species into a good plant, but that it restored an entire ecosystem on land that had once been cleared and grazed. The reserve has now expanded to about 1,250 hectares, and also manages the neighboring 192-hectare Purple Peak Curry Reserve. Only about 50 hectares consist of surviving old-growth forest. Most of the remaining land is covered by gorse, conica, ferns, and young broadleaf forest at different stages of ecological succession. However, forest developing beneath gorse is not necessarily more diverse than forest growing beneath native shrubs. Research comparing gorse with conuca found that the total number of birds and the diversity of seed rain were fairly similar. Young trees may establish and survive more successfully beneath some gorse canopies, but endemic birds such as bellbirds and brown creepers are more common in conuca. Other studies have also found that plant diversity beneath gorse may be lower. Today, Hinewai is home to about 330 native vascular plant species, more than 60 fern species, and around 35 native bird species. Bellbirds, tui, PPP, tomtits, riflemen, cararoo, moorporks, and New Zealand falcons are all present in the reserve. Beneath the layer of fallen leaves, native earthworms measuring up to about 50 centimeters long have also appeared, showing that the recovery is taking place not only in the greenery above, but deep within the soil as well. The reserve and the adjoining land cover most of 4 watersheds. Permanent streams here form more than 50 waterfalls, including Wakamate Falls, which is about 30 meters high. Just imagine, a hillside once dismissed as wasteland covered in weeds now provides wildlife habitat, clean water, and about 20 kilometers of walking trails that are open to the public free of charge. The growing forest is also creating economic value. The project's carbon records show that 546 hectares of regenerating forest are enrolled in the emissions trading scheme, with estimated carbon absorption of about 2,710 metric tons of CO2 per year. Revenue from carbon credits is used to operate the project and purchase additional land for conservation. The proof is hanging on a wall. It consists of 2 photographs taken from exactly the same location above the valley. In the first image, taken in 1988, a yellow hillside covered in gorse stretches all the way down to the sea. In the second, taken 28 years later, a dark continuous forest has appeared, with no gorse visible anywhere in the frame. During the years between those 2 photographs, not a single tree was planted there. No one sprayed any chemicals, and no one dug anything out. People simply removed the livestock from the hillside and stepped back. As of July 2026, Hugh Wilson is 81 years old. He still lives in the small house powered by solar panels. The man who has been proven right by 40 years of photographic evidence does not even use a digital camera. He has no computer or cell phone. He still writes and illustrates the reserve's newsletter by hand, then prints it on paper and sends it through regular mail to 2,000 people. In 2017, more than 400 people came to Hinewai to celebrate the project's 30th anniversary, including local residents, conservationists, and government representatives, and he has never planted a single tree. In the end, Hinewai does not prove that every invasive species is beneficial. It proves that nature sometimes works in ways far more complex than humans imagine. What do you think? Should people intervene more aggressively or step back at the right moment and allow nature to recover on its own? Share your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next incredible stories of ecological recovery.